Great. Well, welcome. I'm Matthew Goodman, the Simon Chair here at CSIS, and delighted to welcome a good crowd on a rainy day. Thank you for coming. I know it's not the best May day in Washington, but there's still hope that things are going to get better soon. Also, welcome to our online viewers, and I want to tell our online viewers that you are, I think, watching the first CSIS program. If it's not the first, it's one of the first two or three on our brand new website, which just launched at noon today. And I encourage everybody to look at the new website. It's a huge improvement over the old one. And so we're delighted to have you aboard as well. Let me thank the supporters of this event. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation made this event possible, and we appreciate their support. A quick word about security. If we should have any kind of incident, just follow me. I'm in charge. We'll either go out that way or there are emergency exits out the back as well. There are restrooms around the back as well if you need those. Please mute any sound devices. And I think that's all the throat clearing I need to do, other than to explain why Banquo is not here yet. I know some of you got that reference. The Japanese all got it because they know Macbeth, right? Kurt Tong is on his way. He was doing a Cuba hearing, and I think he's in a cab now and on his way. So please bear with us, but we'll stall until he gets here. The G7, the group of advanced market democracies, which has been meeting since 1973 in one form or another. It was founded as the G5 Library Group in 1973 as a finance ministers gathering organized by then finance minister Giscard d'Estaing of France, and it included his counterparts from the United States, Britain, Germany, and Japan. And it eventually became a leaders forum in 1975 and has continued in one form or another since for about 15 years. It was a G8, including Russia, but it's back to the G7 since Russia invaded Ukraine. And so we're back to the G7. This is going to be the 42nd meeting of the G7 leaders group. They're meeting in Ise-Shima on May 22nd and 26th and 27th in Ise-Shima, Japan. It is the first time Japan has hosted since 2008 when it hosted the Toyako Hokkaido Summit. And a lot has changed in the 40 plus years since the G7 was founded, but there were two organizing principles behind the G7 when it was founded. The first was stabilizing the global economy. Remember in the early 70s, you'd had two big economic shocks, the end of the Bretton Woods currency system and the Arab oil embargo. And so really the leaders were motivated both by a desire to ensure collectively that they could work together on promoting strong and sustained growth in the global economy. And secondly, those events were also a challenge to the order, to the global order that had been established after World War II, and that these 5 countries, originally now 7, were the champions of. And so those two themes have actually run through the G7 in its work for the last 40 plus years. And so today we have challenges in the global economy, we have challenges to the global order, whether the political or economic or other dimensions of the order. And so those things to me are still pretty important. I know the G7 isn't for everyone. These summits are not for everyone. Some people think, maybe most people, think these are just another meeting, but I still think there is a very important place in the world for the leaders of, still remember the 7 largest advanced market democracies, and all those words are important. They're a unique group, and they have shared interests, shared values, and shared sense of purpose about responsibility for the global commons. And so this meeting has importance, and I'm still a believer in the G7. I hope by the end of this meeting you'll also see that it may do some useful things, and certainly appreciate your input and comments. We have a fantastic group, at least 2/3 of a panel, and soon a complete panel to talk about this. To my immediate left, Abigail Friedman. All of these are old friends, by the way, so this is kind of my own home team here. Abigail and I worked at the embassy in Tokyo longer ago than we'd care to remember. She is a senior advisor at the Asia Foundation, also a senior advisor to my program at CSIS, and so we're delighted to have Abigail with us. Kanji Yamanouchi, I'm sure everybody knows, is the Minister for Economic Affairs at the Japanese Embassy here in Washington, has been here for 3 years probably now, 3 years now, and is a frequent guest at CSIS, so I think he's familiar to many of you. And he's going to go first. And then, if he gets here in time, Kurt Tong, who is the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic and Business Affairs at the State Department, will give a sort of U.S. government perspective on the summit and its agenda. Kurt is also a very old friend. We also worked in the embassy together in the 1990s, and he's now in the senior-most economic position. The State Department, by the way, just administratively, or in terms of the way the G7 is organized, unlike the G20, where the State Department does not have a role formally, there is actually a formal track in the G7 called the Foreign Affairs Sous Sherpas, to use the jargon, which the State Department runs. Actually, there are two tracks, because there's also a political director's track, which deals with political issues. So Kurt will address those issues that come up on the agenda. So I have talked far too much. I was going to do my juggling act until Kurt got here, but I think if we kick it off with Yamanouchi-san with a Japanese government perspective on this, I think we'll be
Thank you very much,
please.
Matt. And I'm very honored, and I'm very happy to be part of this very important event. And here, Kurt.
Here comes Kurt.
Here.
Okay.
And so I try to be very brief, but so let me mention the G7 or G8 or G5, G6 has been a very important venue for the Japanese government to actually do the policy coordination on sometimes on economic affairs, sometimes political affairs, security affairs. And the role of G7, G8 has been very important for the international community. When it was the Cold War era, they talked a lot about security. When the, say, trade friction was very serious, we talked a lot about the economic high.
Good looking.
Yeah.
How are you?
Long time no see.
Kurt Tong.
And actually last week we were together for some other event. And then, so G7 played a so significant role up to today. And today, if you take a look at the world is not necessarily very nice. There are terrorism, refugees, sluggish economies, challenges to the international order, not sort of based on the rule of law, but more like using the force to change the status quo kind of things. So this year, particularly, it's important. But let me mention, for the Japanese government's point of view, we take the 4 major topics as the agenda for G7. This is based on our tradition of G7. 1, this is world economy and trade. This is a matter of course. And second pillar is environment and energy. Third pillar is development. And the fourth, this is politically, security, foreign policy issues. Those 4 are major sort of traditional topics. And this year, when we see world economy, and based upon the cheap oil prices, and also slowdown economies of the emerging countries, including China. And also we see some political or geopolitical risks. So based on those concerns, the world economy from the outset of this year is very sluggish and fluctuate and slowing down. And actually, if we take a look at the forecast, world economy forecast by IMF, 5 years ago, the IMF expected the growth rate of 2016 was 4.8%. But the latest forecast by IMF was just reported last month, only 3.2%. So this is kind of the status of the world economy. So it's so our economy is not doing good. Therefore, the G7 leaders got together to talk a lot about the world economy, try to give the clear messages to maintain sustainable growth, robust growth of the economy. We know the kind of difficult situation, but probably we can take the 4 different measures: monetary policy, fiscal policy, structural reforms. But each country has its own sort of problems and situations. For example, Japan has 200% the national debt. So the fiscal policy would be a difficult part, but the Prime Minister Abe is very much willing to exercise a flexible fiscal policy. And the European countries may have the similar sort of situation. It's always fiscal consolidation versus fiscal policy. And structural reform is always tough and cannot produce the result overnight. But probably each G7 countries will come up with the best mix of monetary policy and fiscal policy and structural reforms try to maintain the world economy at the growth rate, sustainable growth. That is the sort of the part of the world economy. And also trade. If you take a look at those 7 countries, Japan, US, Canada are members of the TPP. And Canada and European countries are negotiating CETA. And also the United States and the European countries are negotiating a TTIP. So now it's nice time to talk about this trade liberalization. That is the one pillar. And second, when we see the environment and energy, we see the cheap oil prices. So this is a nice, important time to talk about that structure of the world energy situation. And also last year, we have agreed upon the Paris Accord, COP21. So we do have the set of the list. So this is a great time for the leaders to talk about this environmental issues. And third, development. And actually, development is related to the various issues, so including the environment, women's issues, and others. And last year, the United Nations adopted the new development goals called SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. That is starting this year up to 2030. So this is also very nice topics. And also, if we take a look at this security and political and foreign policy issues, we do have the various issues I just mentioned, the refugees and terrors and the Middle East, Ukraine, and Asian situation. So those would be the traditional sort of topics. And also, Prime Minister Abe made it very clear he's very much interested in talking about women's issues. Because womenomics, women's empowerment is one of the most important pillars of Abenomics. And also, there are so many things we could do to help the women's empowerment in developing countries, as well as developed countries. So that is one issue. And also, global health. And actually, the Japanese government is very much proud that we are the founding father of global fund to address HIV and the tuberculosis and malaria. That was a product of the G8 meetings in Okinawa. So this year, Prime Minister Abe is very much willing to talk about the health issues because we have experienced Ebola 2 years ago. And we have learned a lot of lessons to address the public health emergencies. We have learned a lot of lessons, especially the initial stage of the Ebola. So that would be the one important issue. And also what we call universal health coverage. This is not about the health insurance in some country. It's more like the access to the health treatment, medicines, and also the hospitals. We're talking about to improve the ability of the developing countries to access those medical treatment. So this universal health coverage is a very important topic. And also what we call AMR, antimicrobial resistance. This is a very serious situation where biologics couldn't affect the disease. So this is a very serious one. So this global health is also very important matters which Prime Minister Abe is paying a lot of attention. And also women's. And so that is sort of the set of the agendas. And also this year is the first, as Matt mentioned, first time in 8 years where G7 or G8 summit be held in Asia. So we will talk a lot about the Asian situation. We have North Korea. We have the problems of rule of laws and freedom of navigation and those things. So we'll discuss that kind of things. And also, finally, and I would like to mention one more thing. That is, we do have outreach meetings. That is, we will invite 6 Asian countries and 1 African country, and also 5 international organizations to talk about, especially development and economic development, and also the other global challenges. We will invite Laos, Vietnam, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Papua New Guinea from Asia. And Laos is a chair country of ASEAN. And Papua New Guinea is a chair country of PIF this year. And from Africa, we will invite Chad. Chad is the chairing country of AU. And also United Nations, OECD, IMF, World Bank, and ADB. So we invite those sort of partners and to discuss the matters. That is also one of the very important sort of, subject for us to reach out to the world. And probably I should stop here for one time. That is a sort of the set of agendas and the programs. Also, you remind me one more thing. The meetings with civil society is a very important part of the G7 summit. So actually, the Sherpas of G7 countries have met as the leaders of civil societies in late March in Kyoto, and also have a lengthy discussions how to sort of enrich the G7 discussions based upon the sort of input from civil societies. And 2 weeks ago, and the Japanese Sherpa also met the representative of civil societies, and they sort of try to formulate the certain sort of course of discussion. So we try to be very inclusive. That is G7 summit in Shima.
Great. Thank you, Yamanouchi-san. That was a fantastic, succinct summary of a very lengthy and complex agenda, and there are lots of things to follow up on. I think Kurt and Abigail are going to touch on that. One thing I want to say that I should have said at the beginning when I was giving the history of the library group before you got here, Clay, you know that history, that I often say that for an organization that has a number in it, they're really bad at math, because this group was a group of 5 countries originally. Then you mentioned the G6. That's what reminded me. There was briefly a G6, and a quiz for anybody who can, prize for anybody who can tell me when the G6 invented. Do you know when the G6, Clay, existed? Yes. Okay, so what happened was in 1975, when the French president invited the 5 to Rambouillet in France, Italy found out about the meeting and insisted on coming. I've forgotten who the prime minister was, but he showed up in Rambouillet and became, so briefly there was a G6. Canada, which was larger than Italy, then found out that Italy had been there, and the next year insisted on coming, and that's why it became a G7, and then an 8, and then back to a 7. So just a little more fun facts and math with this interesting organization. Okay, thanks, Yamanouchi. I've got a couple questions for you to follow up on, but Kurt, please.
Well, thank you, and apologize for being a bit tardy. The fact that I'm here actually, though, indicates the importance of U.S.-Japan relations, because when I told the chairman of the House Homeland Affairs Committee that I had to talk with my old colleague Yamanouchi-san about U.S.-Japan relations in G7, he said, "Get out of here, you're dismissed." So, because the hearing was kind of going long. I'll mention my takeaways up front. I'd like, hopefully, people to go away with a sense that the G7 continues to be a very important forum for deliberation and consensus building about critical global issues. You know, sometimes it gets more attention these days about whether it's a G8 or a G7, but the fact of the matter is that the conversations that will take place in Japan in a couple weeks are extraordinarily important and very significant, and will move the ball forward in meaningful ways on any number of issues that we'll be talking about today. The second is both the utility and success of U.S.-Japan coordination in approaching the G7, as well as the G20, as well as many other international organizations. I had the privilege a few years ago of working on APEC in the successive years that Japan and the United States hosted in 2010 and 2011, and at that time we referred to that that coincidence and our close teamwork as a 1-2 punch in pushing forward issues like the launching of TPP with Japanese involvement and the like. And that is very much the case this year as well with Japan's excellent hosting of the G7. They've done an outstanding job, the Japanese government has, of choosing topics, running ministerials, consensus building, and being both inclusive and decisional in approach. And it's been something that the U.S. government and my colleagues have very much enjoyed participating in, as well as feel like we're going to have a good outcomes. And the last is that this year in particular, there will be some real value added, and much of that value added is some of it comes from traditional G7 topics, but some of it is uniquely created by the points of emphasis that the Japanese government has brought to bear in the G7 this year. And in particular, I'm thinking of the emphasis on women's empowerment and their role in the economy, as well as the health issues, and the special emphasis on those in this year's G7. From the U.S. perspective, we spend a lot of time thinking about what we want to push the most in the G7. And Elizabeth Losinski, raise your hand, who with me goes to lots and lots of interagency meetings where we prioritize and think about what we want to push on the hardest. I thought it might be useful for you all to get a sort of insider's feel of what the U.S. is putting particular emphasis on in this upcoming G7 conversation. And the first, of course, is the global economy and the language and body language, both verbal language and written language and body language, that comes out of the G7 with respect to the critical challenges that Yamanouchi-san mentioned of restoring confidence in the economy and getting some more acceleration in the pace of macroeconomic growth. The expected outcome, I believe, will be a reaffirmation by the G7 of the importance of using all available tools, fiscal, monetary, and structural, to achieve a greater demand and also strong supply-side growth going forward, along with an emphasis of the importance of moving forward on the trade agenda. First and foremost for the United States, the TPP and the transatlantic partnership, but there are other agreements that were mentioned, and that can have an important boosting impact on global investor confidence and therefore investor behavior. The second one for us is refugees and migration. Obviously a very critical issue given the situation with respect to Syria, but it's not just Syria. There are numerous locations around the world where there is a lot of a sharp increase in internationally displaced persons, and addressing those challenges is very, very important. And one of the things that we hope to see emphasized this year is a consensus relating to supporting the World Bank's new effort to increase its flexibility with respect to its activities and what it can do to support lower middle income countries in particular that are facing severe migration-related issues. All of that then ties in very well with the World Humanitarian Summit that precedes the G7 and the major event that President Obama will be hosting in September on a summit on refugees in New York on the margins of the UN General Assembly. Climate, obviously, is critical again this year, even more so because of the success in reaching the Paris Agreement. The G7, of course, will be looking to other countries to rapidly sign up and ratify and realize their commitments under the Paris Accord and find ways to implement them in practical terms. But there are other pieces that are on the agenda this year that are worth highlighting, including the effort at the International Civil Aviation Organization to come up with a global market-based mechanism for for managing aviation emissions, work on HFCs, a very important greenhouse gas source, through an extension and expansion of the Montreal Protocol, new work on methane emissions, and continuing efforts to reinforce what many countries are doing, actually, in the context of lower energy prices, of eliminating and reducing inefficient fossil fuel subsidies around the world. In the health area, I mentioned that for special attention, and I do think that what Japan has led this year in that agenda is extraordinarily important. I'll even give a plug for some little known activities. For example, I told Matt about this the other day. My wife works on international women's rights and reproductive health. And the G7 became an opportunity for an Asian forum of parliamentarians to meet and push their agenda on bringing reproductive health into the rubric of universal health care as expressed worldwide. But the relationship between what the G7 will come up with this year and the US-led global health security agenda is extraordinarily important. Ukraine and Russia deserve special mention. The G7 is a very important context for reviewing and reaffirming the unified stance of the G7 countries with respect to sanctions on Russia, and our determination that the Minsk agreement be implemented fully and in an accountable fashion. That is unfortunately still a festering issue and requires a lot of political emphasis in the G7 context. And then finally, some of the development issues, Yamanouchi-san has already mentioned them. With respect to the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda, the U.S. puts special emphasis on realizing implementation of the Addis Ababa Accord on how to finance development, with the special emphasis on countries coming up with good domestic resource mobilization plans, and also creating investment environments that attract international capital, competitive, market-based, profit-oriented international capital as an important aspect of their development plans. Certainly, I already mentioned women economics and the work that Japan is doing on STEM education and adolescent education for women is very important. And then finally, I would put in a plug for the initiative that the United States is leading called Global Connect, which is an effort to accelerate and re-emphasize additional investment and more rapid investment in creating connectivity for those parts of the world that are currently not connected to the internet. The objective of that initiative is to have 1.5 billion additional people connected to the internet over the next 4 years by 2020. That's an achievable goal, and we recently hosted an event on the margins of the bank fund meetings that attracted pledges, many of which were already ongoing, but some new, of about $20 billion pushed in that direction of accelerating people's connectivity, because the idea behind that is to really make the point to people that the traditional infrastructure of roads, railroads, airports, shipping lines, et cetera, is extraordinarily important economic development. But in the 21st century, if you don't also connect to the electronic highway, the people, and particularly small, medium enterprises, don't really have as much opportunity to grow. So sorry to have gone on so long, but that's kind of what we're pushing.
Terrific,
this year.
and added some new items to the agenda, but emphasized some others, which, again, some of which I want to follow up on. But thank you, Kurt. Abigail.
Great, thank you. Thanks for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming in the rain. So I will come at this G7 from the angle of civil society, based on the work that I've been doing with the Asia Foundation and soon with CSIS. What I'd like to talk a little about is sort of the relationship of civil society to the G7, and then also look at some of the development issues, in particular women and global health. So in terms of the relationship of civil society to the G7, when the G7 first came up, civil society was clearly outside the tent. And what we have seen since the very early days is in the 80s, there were some of the earliest dialogues between civil society and the governments that were involved in what is now the G7. Formal recognition took place in the mid-90s. And from 2006, what we have seen is a more formalized engagement between the G7 and the Sherpas and civil society. Now, obviously, when I say civil society, we're talking thousands, hundreds of thousands. So it would be too simplistic to sort of suggest that there was a pairing of quote unquote civil society and the G7. But there is a formal structure that is starting to take place that I think is a very healthy, useful. It is not exclusive. All of the different civil society actors have ways of engaging with the G7 and, more importantly, with their governments at home as the preparation for the G7 takes place. The Japan Ise-Shima summit is no different. The Japanese civil society groups got together with their counterparts from other of the G7 countries and met with the Sherpas. They met, the last one that I had gotten a readout of was the March meeting, which had been very effective. The reason why these are important is that they're a way, even though every civil society organization would like to have their issues be the central issue of the G7 host country, that's not going to happen. There are just too many issues, and all of them are good. And so the issue is how do you help the G7 prioritize, recognizing that each host country is going to have a few issues that they will call their own. But you also want to maintain momentum, you want to maintain accountability. The worst thing is when high-level international events by governments don't create any continuity or momentum with past. You have to have some level of continuity. So when the civil society groups got together with the Sherpas recently with Japan, they focused on 7 different issues. Not all of them are development, actually 8. So not all are development, but I just thought I would cite them to give you a sense of the kind of things the conversation is taking place. There was a discussion on health, food security, nutrition, gender, women's empowerment, climate change and disaster risk reduction, the SDGs, the Syria conflict, and conflict in general, refugees and responsible supply chain, quality infrastructure investment. I mentioned SDGs, and that's one of the key things to keep in mind with this G7, is that it's the first G7 since the Sustainable Development Goals were agreed upon, setting a target for development for 2030. And all of the development issues that were addressed, are being addressed, and will be addressed at the summit are somehow linked to the SDGs. So when I think in terms of what civil society is looking for from the G7, first off is some measure of continuity with what happened at the last G7. The G7 in Germany had a strong focus on women's issues, women's empowerment issues, and certainly this G7 hosted by Japan Civil Society is looking for building on that, and the signs are hopeful, so we're pleased. So continuity. Looking in terms of health issues, I want to now get a little into some of the details on global health. In Germany, there was the Ebola crisis came up, and that I think has targeted everyone's attention on are the mechanisms for emergency response in place, sufficient, what needs to be done to be built on them. Emergency response, WHO governance reforms, preparedness, universal health care, which is always a challenge because for some of you work on these issues and know them far better than I do, but for those who don't, there's this tension between how do you address the what we call the horizontal universal health care that that allows for access to for everyone to have access to the health care they need in a financial way that they can afford. That's the horizontal. How do you square that with the vertical, which is the effort to target, and that has been quite successful, I have to say, to target specific diseases and to just drill down deep to address and stop the spread of some of these diseases. I think that's one of the big challenges for this Japan summit. And certainly Japan has been a leader on the universal healthcare thing, so I think we can expect, we look forward to having Japan help reconcile the two, because they're both essential. Antimicrobial resistance is another thing that Yamanouchi-san you mentioned, and that the interesting thing there is the role of the private sector in that. You know, when I talk about civil society, there's always the question, well, how do you define it? And I won't read to you the definition that a lot of people use because it's a little bit long, but if you go to the London School of Economics website, they've got a nice long definition. But suffice it to say that civil society includes the private sector as well as non-government organizations. And also I just want to note, sort of a side note, but also important, is that we often talk about the G7 as if it's one event, a summit. And it is one event, a summit. It's extremely important. But all year there have been meetings of different ministries. And that is really key because it allows ministers of the G7 to coordinate as well and figure out how to handle issues. I think the health one will be in the fall. So the foreign ministers obviously happened fairly recently. So the foreign ministers met and they already issued a statement which has a lot on the health issues and talks especially about the World Health Organization's international health regulations. And those are a way of trying to get some kind of a, what's the right word, emergency response, to put some kind of a structure or order into the emergency response efforts, which is important. As you can imagine, when there is an Ebola outbreak, a Zika outbreak, there has to be a standard mechanism for alerting the WHO, for alerting these everyone and being able to respond. Replenishment of the global fund is another issue that has come up and is critical. The global fund has proven very successful in addressing HIV/AIDS, TB, malaria, and countries recovering from Ebola. So that is another area where the civil society definitely wants to see this increasing. Again, I step back just to say that, as you pointed out, the economy is growing more slowly globally, and one of the hugely important issues for civil society and for non-government actors is to make sure that the ODA not only maintains but grows, and Global Fund is a part of that. That we can't afford to have a shrinking of development assistance because of the economy. On women's empowerment, it's a critically important issue. I'm so glad you mentioned Addis Ababa because, again, as I said, the important thing here is for all of these international, important international meetings to build on each other. And the Addis Ababa meeting was key in focusing on financing for development and financing for women's empowerment, for the role of women. So another way of putting this is gender responsive budgeting. One of, I'd say my pet peeves is when we sort of look at these things as pillars, as a gender pillar, and it's in the SDGs as well. So there's a gender pillar, there's a health pillar, there's a conflict pillar. The reality is when it comes to gender, it cuts across all these pillars. And so when we talk about gender responsive budgeting, in any of the development sectors, one has to have budgeting mechanisms that address the particular needs, the particular needs, aspects, concerns of women. And certainly in the health field, that's a classic example where women's health issues are unique in many ways. Women's reproductive health needs to be well funded. So I would say health, women, and money should be the three words that come out of this. These things have to be funded. Also in the context of women, peace and security, there's been a lot of work. The UN SCR 1325 has made tremendous strides in getting, in addressing the aspect of women in conflict and in post-conflict. I think the point we want to underline here, and certainly work that the Asia Foundation has done a lot on, is making sure that women both have a seat at the table and that it's a meaningful seat at the table. That's something that that is really a classic issue for governments to take on. When we're talking about conflict resolution, governments are usually in the lead on this, and we turn to governments to have them ensure that at every level of negotiation and conflict resolution that women are involved. Let's see. So I think that's pretty much the highlights of what I wanted to say. As I said, there are a lot of issues on when it comes to civil society and engaging with the G7, but these will be the key ones. Going forward, girls and women have to be at the center of development efforts. If we're going to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, if Prime Minister Abe is going to achieve his goals in womenomics, then we've got to address this across the board.
Great, super. Okay, great. Again, additional food for thought and emphasis on a couple of the other important elements of the agenda. Another clarification of the lexicography of the G7. The term Sherpa, I think most of you know, are the leader's personal representative who works the agenda throughout the year. Is affectionately known as the Sherpa because that's the person who takes the leader up the summit. And incidentally, the people who take the Sherpa up the summit are known as yaks, which those of us who used to serve in that role feel is an important point to make about that important role. I got a haircut, by the way, since. Okay, you made an important point, Abigail, about continuity, and that's something that is an important feature of these summits, carrying forward. There's always a role of stewardship for every host of carrying forward the agenda, but then understandably giving their own spin to the agenda. And you can see that in Japan's carrying forward the basic core agenda, but then adding its own areas of emphasis along the lines of the things that all of our speakers emphasized. Let me ask a couple of quick questions, and then I'll let the audience jump in. Actually, a comment first. I think the fiscal issues in the global economy bucket, everybody's going to agree on structural reform, but structural reform is really difficult. So, and it's difficult for a group like this to impel anybody to move forward on those issues. Monetary policy may have some limitations at the moment. In particular, fiscal seems where the real money is, pun intended. But it seems as though there's a pretty clear rift in the group with 6 countries on one side and 1 on the other, and I won't mention any names, but the one on the other's initials are Germany. And so I think that in practice it's going to be quite difficult. If anybody disagrees, I'd be interested in hearing that. That's a comment. But also in the growth category for Kurt, you mentioned the importance of trade. You both did. And you mentioned APEC. In APEC, in our host year, we advanced the ball on environmental goods liberalization by getting APEC economies to agree to keep tariffs below 5% by last year, I guess, right? And now that reinvigorated the multilateral talks on environmental goods. Is that the kind of thing, I've always felt that if the G7 leaders or G20 leaders could give their trade ministers a strong political push to move forward with those negotiations, that would be quite helpful. Can we expect anything like that? More than just trade is good and we need to continue to make progress. Do you think there's a prospect for actually using the G7? Whether that or some other aspect of the multilateral
I
agenda.
think there's some utility in that, and certainly there will be statements of affirmation about the importance of trade investment liberalization and moving forward with all of those agendas. But actually, you mentioned G20, and this is one of those points where there are, and it's actually a point of coordination within the G7, centered around the G7 chair, G7 host, of which issues are we going to emphasize in G7 and on which in the G7 is our consensus so easy that our real target is the G20. And trade, you mentioned environmental goods and services agreement, that is actually the G20 is a very target-rich environment for pushing forward that effort, whereas the G7 is not, there aren't really any problematic players in it. So while we affirm the importance of it, it's hard to do something that actually then triggers, like the APEC agreement that you mentioned, triggers actual forward progress. I think another one that would fit that category is, I didn't mention the anti-corruption efforts in my remarks, which are extraordinarily important. The UK led a major event on that last week or the week before, which helped move the ball forward globally on that issue. But the G20 is, again, a more, I guess, fair way to say is target-rich environment than the G7 in making really bold forward progress on that. So I anticipate that the more between the events in Ise-Shima and the ones in Hangzhou, the ones in Hangzhou might be a little more pivotal with respect to trade.
Okay, that's helpful. In a similar spirit to your answer, a question for you, Yamanouchi-san. One other country that is not going to be at the G7 but will be at the G20, indeed hosting the G20 this year, is China. And you alluded very briefly in passing that there would be discussion of the South and maybe East China Seas. Do you expect those to be a central theme? And more broadly, it seems as though the G7 could usefully talk about its analysis of the opportunities and the challenges of a risen China, of a strong, powerful China, given that there have been some rifts within the group about the approach to China. For example, famously the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where the four European members decided to join, and the three Pacific powers chose not to join, or have chosen not to join yet. Sort of strange that the G7 would split in that way over an issue like that, and I wonder if there's an underlying difference of analysis about China that might be a topic of conversation at the summit.
Yes, well, I just mentioned this 2016 G7 summit is first time in 8 years, which is held in Asia. In a sense, that is very natural for G7 leaders to talk about the Asian situation, which is on one hand, the fastest growing area in the world. So the Asia Pacific or Asia could be the engine for the growth. But at the same time, we have eyewitnessing what's happening in North Korea, what's happening in South China Sea, and etc. And we see certain sort of situation where the status quo has been challenged, not by the rule of law, but by the using force. So this situation will be the possible, subject to be discussed. And actually, foreign ministers meeting was held last month in Hiroshima. And the first ever the sitting Secretary of State visited Hiroshima. That was one big issue. But at the same time, the content was very rich. Those 7 foreign ministers discussed a lot, very lengthy talks. And one of those topics was South China Sea and others. So in a sense, we just expect the G7 leaders will discuss. But the thing is, we say G7, but actually 9 people are there.
I was going to say.
And the 2 people from EU. So we have to coordinate very well to utilize the limited times to discuss. I just mentioned 4 major topics plus 3 additional ones. And also I didn't mention cybersecurity and anti-corruption. So there are so many issues. So probably between now and then, Sherpas will be working hard to coordinate what subject will be discussed in which frame of the discussion. So I cannot anticipate how much they discuss on those specific issues, but I'm sure that they will discuss, because this is the first time in Asia. And talking about the relation with the G20, but I just say G7 is a great venue for world leaders to discuss many matters which face international communities. And 25 years ago, G7 countries counted for almost 70% of the world GDP. But today, it's around 50%. That means more focus on G20. But when it comes to G20, actually more than 30 people come together, and so diversified. So sometimes G20 is a great venue to discuss, but difficult place to make an agreement. But G7 is very like-minded, and only 7+2. So I think that what G7 will discuss will be a great input to the G20. And also between G7 and G20, there will be a TCAD meeting in Africa. The TCAD, I assume you may be familiar with that, the Tokyo International Conference on African Development, which was initiated in 1993. We had, every 5 years, we had a summit. But this year, first time outside of Japan and in Kenya. And this is a forum about African development. So this is a great venue for discuss development in terms of African countries. But Abigail just mentioned development relates almost everything. So this is also a great thing. So G7 will be a great sort of groundwork for TCAD and also G20. That's the way I see it.
Great. Okay, thanks. Again, I told you the math is really complicated in these groups, so it's really a G9 because the EU gets 2 additional seats. The president of the European Commission and the president of the European Council both get to attend in addition to the 4 European countries. And the G20, I've counted, is actually 53 countries because it's 19 individual countries plus the 28 members of the European Union who get 1 seat, plus 6 invited guests. And that's not counting all the international organizations. So it's a big group. Okay, Abigail, one question for you. So you mentioned the need for ODA budgets to be maintained, and you mentioned also the tension between the sort of horizontal versus vertical issues in global health, which leads me to ask about, there was a day when the G7, 8 was announcing big money initiatives. I mean, big dollar initiatives that committed to, Yamanouchi-san mentioned that Japan had given birth to the Global Fund after its hosting in 2000. That seems something like that, which was a big, commitment of financing from the G7 countries as the principal, most of the big aid donor countries. In days of tight budgets, limited ODA budgets, it seems like that kind of thing is going to be very difficult. Is civil society going to feel disappointed if there aren't sort of big number commitments like that, and are more focused on these sort of broader things that sound good and are useful, but aren't really as targeted on delivering finance to funding to these issues?
One of the things that I was in government before, and now I'm out of government, and one of the things that always happens in government is as we get closer and closer to meetings, everyone says, okay, what are the deliverables? And people run around trying to put together deliverables. So I actually, and again, I'm wary about speaking for civil society as a group, but I could give a civil society perspective, or my perspective as this, is that I don't know that one needs a brand new, big new thing as much as maintaining and growing funding on the Global Fund. There was Gavi. You know, there are things in place. Yeah, the vaccine. Sorry. So these things that were actually led by Japan in 2000 and in 2008. We would expect Japan to maintain leadership in terms of replenishment funds on these. So that's what one would look for. There was recently, I'm not an environmental expert, but there is a new fund that was created, if I understand correctly, at COP21 for climate and green climate fund, I believe. So, and that's the kind of thing that, you know, you don't have to create a new one at the G7, but I would hope that the G7 would take the opportunity to ensure that that kind of a funding, that kind of a funding mechanism is well funded.
Okay, thanks. Let me invite the audience to jump in and ask questions. If you do have a question, like Stanley, can you please, now that I've identified him, he doesn't have to identify himself, but please wait for the microphone, Stanley, and
Stanley Roth, unaffiliated. Listening to the presentation, I came away with the impression, and I'm hoping you're going to correct me that I'm wrong, that the pillar with the least likely progress is the one that the G7 was originally created for, which is the world economy and growth. Sounds like a lot of reaffirmation, but not a lot of action. And then you have two other pillars where a lot's going to happen, but not necessarily get any global attention, right, with the environment, energy, and in the development, important stuff, but sort of like an APEC meeting. It never makes the line where the public knows what happens, which means disproportionate attention is likely to be in the security and foreign policy piece, which really isn't supposed to be part of the G7. Nothing can happen on South China Sea without China, and little can happen on North Korea without China. So to me, Kurt, it all comes down to Russia sanctions, that if you come away with a good statement from this group supporting Russian sanctions despite the opposition in Europe, it'd be easy to say successful meeting. If you don't, it's going to strike me as a lot harder. So please tell me where the flaw is in that analysis.
okay, Kurt, I heard your name.
I did hear my name too.
Under the Republican debate rules, you get a 30-second
30-second
rebuttal.
I find it difficult to predict exactly what the media is going to focus on because they tend to be a bit unpredictable. But and fragmented, because I think, you know, you mentioned the health and development and climate issues is perhaps not getting that much attention. I think that there are segments of global society and segments of the media that in fact give priority attention to those issues, and so in certain media channels, those will get very heavy coverage. But what, you know, the top broadsheets and television networks decide to focus on, it's anybody's guess. I do take some issue with reaffirmation of the macroeconomic goals being purely lateral or a pass or a buy, if you will, because I think that in the overall scheme of things, keeping that emphasis, even if it's the same emphasis as has been stated previously, or the same emphasis that was stated at the finance ministers meeting that's already been held, the G7 finance ministers meeting, actually is impactful, because our friends in other countries, and unlike Matt, I won't call out any individual nations, but they actually do understand what it means when we're reaffirming the importance of all available tools, and that is then, that's the public aspect, and then it's reinforced with quite a lot of private dialogue to really emphasize what we, you know, our mutual advice about macroeconomic stances.
I would just add that I think I've often said that I share your skepticism about the ability of a G7 or a G20 to deliver big outcomes, except in crisis, on the global economy. So I think the reaffirmation is probably the best you can get. You know, that's not unimportant. Setting that agenda and setting that goal out there is important. I would prefer to see them focus on what I call bricks in the road, little things that are concrete and tangible that point towards the objective that they've stated. That people know you're not going to get there in one summit, but if you can do something concrete and tangible, when you in passing took a swipe at APEC, so in defense of that and the good work that Kurt did in 2011, the motto that he came up with that we had put on the back of T-shirts was, the PG version was "Get Stuff Done," and we very much focused on trying to advance the ball on some specific issues like environmental goods liberalization, which was stalled in the WTO, and we gave it a good shove. And that restarted the global conversation. That's inspired by that good experience. That's what I'm sort of thinking the G7 leaders should be looking for, is specific things. Don't solve every problem, but advance the ball. People can read the paper and see, oh, that actually, that's measurable progress towards that objective. It's not the whole objective, but it's something meaningful. So that's what I'm looking for.
If I may, this is a classic situation of half full, half empty, and we have to distinguish what will be reported and what is discussed. And the media, there are many medias, but the media has certain function to let people know things. But what is discussed is probably for us, it's more important. And G7 is not just a leaders meeting for 2 days. For that summit, there are so many policy coordinations among the countries through Sherpa meetings or the working level coordinations and the things. And I didn't mention that this year, leaders meeting plus 10 different ministerial meetings, finance minister, foreign minister, energy minister, education, environment, health and transportation, etc. So all those 10 different ministerial meetings has its own sort of venue and platform to discuss. And discussion is just discussion, but this discussion can be the great sort of groundwork for the next actions. And now the international community has faced a sort of very difficult situation. So talking nice thing is very different from implementing it. But still, this is all the leaders discuss certain things, which is very tough and very complicated. But that discussion, I believe, provides the foundation for the next actions.
Great, thanks. Other questions? Yes, sir, Gary.
Thank you, Matt. Gary Littner with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. A couple questions. Last year, under the G7 chairmanship of Germany, they started the G7 Alliance on Material Efficiency.
On what efficiency?
Material efficiency.
Material efficiency.
Right. So that was like promotion of circular economy. There were a number of workshops. Ministers of Environment spoke. Is that an initiative that will continue? Is there continuity in this aspect? It was unclear from the last few conversations we've had. And kind of in a similar vein, there are some new ideas that have been proposed, for example, by the French president, Monsieur Hollande, who said that pricing of pharmaceuticals should be part of the G7 agenda. Is that going to have any legs, or is that disruptive for continuity? What do you see happening in those two areas?
Talking about the continuity, the Japanese Sherpa has been communicating very closely with the German Sherpa, and also the working level the officials, but stay pretty much the same. And we study very carefully what was discussed last year. And when it comes to the health area, AMR is a clear continuation and the consistency of the discussion. The G7 leaders meeting in Germany continue to the sort of working level discussion and to the G7 summit and also health ministers. And one good example I can give you is for the Japanese health minister held the health ministers meeting among Asian countries to carry out what we discussed about AMR in Asia. Because AMR, if you're expert, you have to sort of take undertakings simultaneously as wide as possible. So as a chair of G7, Japan took that lead to discuss those things in Asia. So that is also another one sort of a good example of the continuation from the previous summit chair country to us.
You know, on this question of follow-up and accountability, I just would point out that starting last year, there was a mechanism put into place, and you know, we at the State Department have devoted human resources to doing this, of keeping track of implementation of various G7 announcements over the years, and then explaining publicly what has or has not been done to match the various announcements that have been made previously. And I believe it's at the end of this week, right, that Japan will be putting out a document that describes that in some detail.
Accountability. Mm-hmm. Okay. Other questions? I see somebody in the back.
Stanley Kober. A couple of months ago, the Bank for International Settlements wrote, "We may not be seeing isolated bolts from the blue, but the signs of a gathering storm that has been building for a long time." I'm wondering if there are any options left, or if we are facing some sort of checkmate for the global economy. Structural reforms were just mentioned as being virtually impossible with the unemployment that exists in much of the world. Monetary policy, and we have negative interest rates. Look what happened in Japan, and the US will be raising interest rates. Fiscal policy, you already have budget deficits out the wazoo, and in Japan, 25% of tax revenue already goes to servicing the public debt. What happens to Japan when the Fed continues to raise interest rates? What options are left?
Okay. What I'll do, because we only have a few minutes left, is take two other questions, and then I'm going to ask Clay to answer that question. But seriously, do we have other questions? I didn't recognize this side. Okay. Not your last chance. You can think if you still have one more question. I don't know, Kurt, do you want to try to take that on?
I would just go back to the importance of all available tools. I mean, what you read out was a dire, or at least written in a dire way, but I don't think anyone up here has said that structural reform is virtually impossible. That it is difficult, but in a global environment where many of the advanced economies are facing demographic challenges, which are new and relatively unique as a historical economic phenomenon, and when technological change is changing the global economy in ways that have impact on employment patterns that we don't yet, I don't believe, fully understand in the global economy. There's a lot to do, but I don't think there's any utility in being sort of panic-ridden about the situation. I think that governments and also private sectors respond to these challenges as they arise, and I'm actually relatively optimistic that given the global challenges that there will be concerted effort, particularly in the area of structural reform, and that is what you, at the end of the day, are hearing, even in our own political discourse domestically in the United States, is what elements of structural reform are most important for our economy and how should we go about pursuing them.
I echo Kurt. And if we see demand side, and there's an enormous gap of infrastructure, so especially in developing countries. And the Prime Minister related his initiative like $110 billion infrastructure investment in 5 years. And that is one of the example of the creating the demand in developing countries. And also due to the cheap oil prices, it has various impact, positive and negative. If we see the positive side in the domestic consumers, like in the United States or in Japan, so the less cost for energy means more purchasing power. So that could be expected to boost certain sort of consumption. And also, if we take a look at the supply side, and one of the major outcome of achievement of Paris Agreement last year is innovation, especially for new renewable energy areas. So creating the new innovation for the new energy source, that would be a great input to the additional supply power of that, so supply side. And also the place where demand and supply meets is trade and investment. The agreements like a TPP or negotiation like a TTIP or RCEP may create a certain sort of momentum to boost trade and investment. And also rule of laws areas, I just mentioned just one word, anti-corruption, tax evasion. That kind of undertakings will also make sure that they are very fair sort of a playground for the world business. So in that sense, there are certain sort of things which will affect the world economy in a positive way. But the question is not just overnight. It may take some time. Monetary policy is the same. If you apply the one additional new policy, it takes some time to take the actual sort of impact to the real economy. So each country is taking the very serious sort of measures which is available to the authorities. So we'll see. I try to be optimistic about that.
So do I. So I share most of that. Okay, there's one more question. The gentleman in the back there, just in front of the previous. Yep.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Elias Sokwara, and I'm with the Global Governance Institute. I wanted to touch upon a point that was made about cybersecurity as an agenda item for the G7, but touch on a related issue, which is privacy, and really how it plays out in the ability of economies to function together. Right now, there's this major disagreement between the US and the EU with regards to the ability of companies based in the US to transfer data from Europe. Now, when you look at APEC, for instance, you have an existing agreement, a framework that allows countries that are part of that arrangement to transfer the data. And of course, Japan, the US, and Canada, and various other countries are very active in it. And so I'm wondering, to what extent will privacy animate the discussions at the G7 with respect to the ability of a global economy?
If I may, a couple of weeks ago, we had the information ministers meeting in Shikoku, Japan. And there are the 4 major sort of achievements that they issued the documentation. So you can take a look at that in terms of the cyber and the digital economy. Privacy is a very important one. But the G7 countries agreed upon the principle of the freedom of free flow of data and information. But at the same time, the privacy has to be protected in a proper way. So they agree that. So we need to achieve those 2 goals. And so that the G7 countries try to coordinate the policies so that they can maximize the positive impact of the protection of the privacy and also cybersecurity of the things. But the key is freedom. But at the same time, proper protection is important. So they have those principles. So I do not really think there's a sharp distance among the G7 countries. But if we take a look at the world, certain sort of differences. Under the name of the privacy protection, some country may invoke to the actual sort of freedom of the business and also the flow of data things. So we'll have to be very careful. But as long as G7 is concerned, we are on the same page.
You know, I actually share your concern and have a slightly different view than Yamanouchi-san. I'm a little concerned. This is another area where we do have a different perspective across, if you draw a line down the Atlantic, I think there's a different perspective
just let me point out
east
that
of that line versus
we did
west.
reach a revised arrangement with the European Union with respect
I
to
think that's true, but I
privacy.
also think there are different sort of philosophical and practical and political forces at play on those issues. And that's the reason for the G7 to sit down and talk about those things. And I just wanted to end on that note that I think people often underestimate the value of leaders of these countries, of any countries, but particularly this group of large, advanced market democracies to get together to talk about shared challenges and where they have a slightly different approach to try to share their perspectives and and get better understanding. I know that's easy to be cynical about, but if you think about, I said this at our press conference this morning on the G7, leaders are lonely people. Think about who they interact with day to day. It's not their peers very much. I mean, they don't have a chance to sit down as we're doing and talk through issues as peers. So I actually think there's quite a lot of power in these leaders getting together for a couple of days to talk through issues like this and understand. They don't necessarily resolve all problems, but I think there's a power in that by itself, and that's why I think the G7 still would need to be created if it didn't exist. But hopefully it will also get some things done that will at least make headlines in some media forms. So let me thank or ask you to join me in thanking our panelists for a great presentation today. Coming on a rainy day, and we're going to continue the following the G world and invite you to join us in that exploration. So thanks so much.